But I want to share a motto with you that I've heard through the years. It may be your motto this morning. Have you ever heard the old saying, don't do today what you can put off until tomorrow? I have been very guilty of that a few times. Well, sometimes yet. Normally I get caught when I do that. We need to do what we can, when we can, as we have opportunity on that in particular. And time is of an essential that we don't take for granted that we'll have tomorrow. That we don't take for granted that even we'll have this afternoon. As we have opportunity in life right now, we need to make the very best use of that. And I want to use an illustration in the book of Daniel, a person in particular out of chapter 5, book of Daniel, that I believe pretty well demonstrates of how quick that time can get away from us and how that we're left without being ready to meet God. Listen to this. In the book of Daniel, have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Belshazzar? Some say that he was Nebuchadnezzar's son. Some people think that he was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. But the point of it is that I'm not so concerned about whether it's a son or a grandson, but what happens in his life here. And I want to read to you this, and I'm going to start in verse 22, what it says that happened to him. And I want you to notice as I read this how soon and how quick things happened in his life there. Now notice what it says in verse 22. These are the words of Daniel speaking to Belshazzar. And thou, his son, that's talking about Nebuchadnezzar's son, O Belshazzar, has not humbled thy heart. Now Daniel's telling him this, and he says, though thou knewest all this, and the this he's talking about, we'll go back and cover in a minute, and part of it's in verses 18 and 19, but he's telling Belshazzar there, he says, even though you knew some truths, you did not humble your heart before God. You put it off. And there's a world of people that do that same thing today. Well, that is what he's talking about here in verse 22. But then he says this in verse 23. But instead of humbling yourself before God, he says, but has lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, God Almighty. And they have brought the vessels of his house, that would have been Belshazzar's servants, have brought the vessels of the house, he's talking about God's house, or the temple of God, before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. In other words, a mockery to the real God is what he's getting at. And thou hast praised the gods of silver, of gold, and of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not. In other words, they're not even really gods. They're just things been carved out. Nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand, catch this next phrase, thy breath is. He says, in whose, the real God in whose, in other words, controls whether or not you have the next breath or not. Have you ever considered that in your life today? That in our lives, did you know this next breath that you and I are taking right now, that would not even be possible if God said that's it. It would be over. I mean, we're that close to death. But yet when we're like that and not humbling ourselves before God, what a dangerous thing. And it's like playing with fire. And that was what Belshazzar was doing here. Let me read the rest of it, and then I want to go back to verse 18 and 19 and talk about what he says there. But he says this, in other words, they brought out the vessels that were used to worship the real God that they had taken from Jerusalem when they had taken over control of the Jews, brought them and put them in their treasure house, and Belshazzar is getting ready to make a statement, and the statement he's making is, I'll show you how great their God is. We're going to drink wine out of their vessels they use to worship God. That's what it was all about. And notice what it says this. After he tells him, he says, and the real God in whose hand thy breath is, and who are all thy ways, in other words, your life, all that you do, and has not glorified, then was part of the hand sent from him or from God, and this was the writing. Let me just give you a little background before we go into what was written on the wall there. Here was what Belshazzar, he was having a big party. I mean a big party. I think it says there was like 1,000 people invited to that party, and it was all for his honor. This was no pity party. This was a party, big party. And what happens as he has got all of these leaders over all of his kingdom, and it must have been pretty good size at that time, or you wouldn't have up to around 1,000 of the people of importance coming to that party. So you know what he does? They get probably, I'm going to call it 3 sheets in the wind after they've been drinking wine. And he tells his servants, go get those vessels that the Jews worship the real God in and bring them out here, and I'll show you how great I am. And they did. And they take those vessels, and they're drinking wine to their gods instead of the real God, out of the vessels that were to be used in holy worship to the real God. And during all of that, and how everybody's saying, boy, you are such a wonderful, wonderful king, Belshazzar, there's a hand that starts writing on the wall. Just the hand. And as it writes there, and I like what it has to say. You can read this in the earlier part of the chapter. But his countenance was changed. It was no longer jolly with wine, but he realized that that writing on the wall was for his benefit. And the Bible says, I'm going to put it in Arkansas terms, his knees began to knock. I mean, he was that afraid. Now, you know, have you ever thought of this? I did when I was reading that. You know, that writing on the wall could have been something good as well as bad, but because of what he was doing, he realized he was in big, big trouble. He knew it was not going to be something written for him for the good, but for the bad. That was all taking place. Now, notice what happens here when Daniel begins to tell him what that writing on the wall was, because Belshazzar's own wise men, and they couldn't even tell what it was. They didn't know what that meant that was written on the wall, but God's man Daniel did. And notice what it says here, starting in verse 24. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. Now, verse 25, here was what it was written. And this is the writing that was written. I may pronounce this wrong, but you bear with me. Mene, Tekel, or Tekel, Upharsin. Farsin. All right, well, I butchered that up. Let's see what it means. Verse 26. This is the interpretation Daniel is telling Belshazzar. You see him, his knees are still knocking. He knows he's in trouble, but he's not sure to what extent. And here's what it says. This is the interpretation of the thing. Meaning, God has numbered thy days and finished it. Belshazzar, your time is up on this earth. God's numbered your days, and they're now over. Now notice, that was what that first part of it meant. Now the second part means this in verse 27. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and are found wanting. You've been weighed in the balances of God. Balances like, you know, whenever it balances out or one thing's more heavy than another. That's the kind of balances he's talking about. But he's saying, you have been weighed in God's balances and you've been found wanting. In other words, it won't balance out with your life. Now, think of that for a minute. Have you ever considered in your life that there'll come a time of accounting of you before the throne of God? And you'll be weighed in the balances just like he was. Now, the real question is this. If when we're all weighed in the balances, people, we want to make sure it balances right. You understand what I'm saying? I can tell you exactly what will cause it to be balanced right. His name is Jesus Christ. When our faith and our confidence and our hope is placed in Jesus Christ, that balances out all of the bad. You know, Connie, I don't have to look at you and know what bad is in a person. I know it in myself real well. And if we're all honest, we've got that sinful side, and thank God we can balance out because of Jesus Christ. But in this case, because of the way this guy was living his life, the second part of that writing there, that tekel, simply meant you've been waving the balances, Belshazzar, and you've been found wanting. In other words, you're not ready. You're not right, even though you're dying tonight. Now notice what the last part of it says. Verse 28. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That kingdom that was so great that he had sent invitations to so many people to come to this big party that he had, and I think it was like 1,000. That meant that he had a vast, vast kingdom. And then this last verse I just read to you, he says, your kingdom's fixing to be divided up between the Medes and the Persians. Now let's look at that for just a minute here. Nebuchadnezzar, actually Belshazzar, he didn't really win any of this, or he didn't conquer anything for this. He just simply took over when that Nebuchadnezzar had died. And Nebuchadnezzar, you know, there was a time to where that he thought, let me read verses 18 and 19. That'll clear this up. He thought that everything, every battle he's won, everything, every kingdom he'd conquered, that it was all because of him and his hand. Notice what 18 and 19 in this same chapter says. O thou king, the most high, gave Nebuchadnezzar. Did you catch that one little word? Gave. The king, the most high, is talking about God. And it says, God gave Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, a kingdom, and with that kingdom, majesty and glory and honor. And he's talking about there, and he says, when God gave it to him, Nebuchadnezzar didn't see it that way, that God gave him that. He saw that he had done all of this conquering by himself. Look at verse 19. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he slew, or in other words, he killed, whom he would keep alive, he kept them alive, whom he would set up, in other words, in a place of authority, he set up, and whom he would put down. He did that. He done that at his discretion. Now, here's the point, though. For people that are trying to gather up this world's goods and everything they can in this life, did you know Nebuchadnezzar? He may have been a great man of war, and God did give him the ability to do those things. But you know what? There came a time when he was just like every other human being. His life was over. And as it was, then that was passed on to this son or grandson. But in the process of that, I want to read these last few verses down there where we were at. Phil, if you can hang with me there for just a minute. After the reading of that, it says this in verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel, in other words, because he did interpret the dream. And he had told anybody who could do that would have these things, it says here. And they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. Well, that looks good and high as far as authority. But what Daniel has just told him, as your kingdom, your time is up, and your kingdom is over. Notice what happens in verse 30 and 31. In that night, I want you to remember that. In that very same night that Daniel had prophesied to him and told him what was going to happen to him, your life is over. You've been weighed in God's balances. You've been found wanting. In other words, you're not ready to go. But it says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. That very night, his life was over because he was killed. No doubt he was killed by someone from the Persians or the Medes, one of those two. And then it says this in verse 31. And Darius, the Median, took the kingdom, and being about 62 years old, Darius, that tells us why they put how old he was. I don't know. That's not what I want to focus on. He was 62 years old when he took that over. But here's the point I'm trying to get at this morning. In one night's time, everything that this guy had going for him, ruler over a kingdom where he could invite probably 1,000 people to his big birthday party. He's doing things the way he wants to and everything. And a handwriting comes on the wall and says, it's over, buddy. Your time is over. How quick that life was over. Now, I want us to look at that just toward ourselves this morning. Did you know before this service is over, you could be sitting there and your phone either buzz because you've got it on mute or ring out, and it could be a phone call that your life will never be the same again if somebody calls in on you. One of your loved ones has just been died. They've been killed in a car wreck. They've died at home. Life, people, is an uncertain thing. It's very uncertain. And because of that, in one night's time, Belshazzar lost it all. He lost his kingdom. He lost this opportunity that he had to be right with God. He had seen in his life, and it's brought out here, if you want to read the earlier part of this same chapter, of how that it's brought out, of how that God worked in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. He even brought him down one time. He lived out in the woods or the fields like a wild animal for about 7 years. God humbling him. He wasn't as great as he thought he was. But did Belshazzar pay any attention? He didn't. Not one bit. So what does that tell us about our own lives? Proverbs 27:1 says this. Boast not of tomorrow. Anybody want to sit here and boast or brag about what you're going to do tomorrow? You know why you can't? Because we don't know whether we got tomorrow or not. But in Proverbs 27:1, he tells them there, he says, boast not of tomorrow. He says, for thou knowest not what a day may bring. You don't even know what's in the day. I don't even know what's in the rest of this day. And then he says this, the future is hidden. It's an uncertain thing. And therefore, there's some things in life, people, that we need to make sure we've got in its proper place. And one of the main things is our standing with God. Started as a great party, everybody looking up to him, and before it's over, his knees are knocking. And Daniel gives him this prophecy, you're going to die tonight. It's over. And so, people, that is something I think that we need to keep in mind here. And, you know, we can look at ourselves. You say, well, I am very, very fit for my age. I can't say that. Listen to what that Ecclesiastes has to say on that very thing there in verses 11 and 12. It says this. Let me find my place. 9, 11, and 12. Here we go. I returned. Now, this was old Solomon speaking through his wisdom. He said, I returned and saw under the sun that the race, and he's talking about life's race, the race is not to the swift, not to the fastest runner. And he says, nor the battle to the strong or to the strongest one. Neither yet bread to the wise, in other words, because of their wisdom, nor yet riches to men of understanding. Great educations. nor yet favor to men of skill, because of how skillful they are in different things. But he says this, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Did you know what? Every one of us sitting right here, there'll come a time when God says, hey, this life is over. It's time to go home. Time and chance happens to everybody according to the book of Ecclesiastes. Let me give you another illustration. I think whenever we make statements, we ought to be able to back that in the Bible by what the Bible says, and I believe it does give illustrations. I want you to listen or look into the book of Luke, chapter 12. You'll know this one very, very well. Book of Luke, chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. Listen to how this guy was planning and plotting out his life and what he was going to do next in it and everything, and what God said and what happened. Listen to this. Luke chapter 12. Let me find my place again where it's at. 16 through 21. Listen to this. And he spake a parable unto them. This he here is talking about Jesus, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. In other words, he had a good year of harvest. And then it says this, and he thought, this rich man thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? What am I going to do? Now, he's asking this question because he's run out of room. And he says, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. In other words, he had had such a bountiful year till his barns were full. What am I going to do now? Well, it tells you what he says here. He even begins to plan out what he's going to do next. And he said, verse 18, this will I do. I will pull down my barns. In other words, you can say, I'm going to tear down these old barns, and I'm going to build some big ones where I can put all this in there. That's what he's saying. I'm going to pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow, I'm going to store all my fruits and my goods. And now catch what he says in this next verse, 19. And I will say, I'll tell my soul, I'll say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Now let me ask a question. Do you really think a man's soul is happy in that? Now the physical part of us may be that you got all these things piled up. But is the soul really concerned about having all of these things piled up? I'll tell you what I think. No, I don't think it is. But notice what, after he makes that statement, I'm going to tear the old barns down, I'm going to build new ones, I'm going to fill them up, and when I get them all full, then I'm going to tell my soul, take your ease, be it pleasure and everything, because you've got plenty to rely on. And notice what the next verse says. Verse 20. But God said unto him, that's talking about the man with the barns, that's had a real bountiful year. Thou fool. God calls him a fool. This night, did you catch that? That's just like old Belshazzar. This night, he says, thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall all those things be which you have provided? All these things you've collected and put back and accumulated. You ever think of that? It brings a smile to my face to think what my kids are going to have to put up with when I die. I've got a shop. It'll take them 6 months to get it all cleared out. Anything with worth in there? Probably not. But did you ever think about that? We put back, we slave, we do everything in our power to put back and keep and get more and more and more. And one of these days we die, and guess what? You're just going to leave the kids to fight over it. My kids are not like that. Well, maybe not. But is it really worth giving that much time to things that are so temporal and so physical, knowing that we're going to live in, well, let me restate that. We're going to exist in one of two places. We live, Diane, if we go to heaven. We exist if we end up in a devil's hell. That's kind of the way I see it. So what I'm trying to say is this. In one night's time, Belshazzar lost everything he had, and he died, and he had to face God. In one night's time, when this farmer was planning his life out, that I'm going to put all of these things back, and when I get to that point, then I'm going to tell my soul, let's take our ease. God tells him, you're not going to have time for that because you're coming home tonight. Book of James, chapter 4, says this. You know not what shall be on the morrow. None of us know what tomorrow's going to hold. I hope it's good. But I've seen some times when I hoped it was good and it turned out it wasn't so good. But he tells them in James chapter 4, verse 14, you know not what shall be on the morrow. And then he asks a question. He says, what's your life? What is your life really about? And then he makes this statement in the last part of this verse. What is your life? He says, even a vapor that appears for a little time, just a short amount of time, and then vanishes away. If you got up early this morning, especially down on White River, it was a little foggy. Give you odds if you went there right now, you don't see any fog. Sun hits the fog and it just kind of dissipates. Goes. Nothing left. And he makes the connection here and says our life is like a vapor or like fog. It's just here for a little while and it's gone. But our time here is very important. Some of the choices we make. Conclusion. One night can change everything. This is what I came up with when I wrote this down. Make peace with God. Make sure that things are right between you and God. You don't have to look over to your husband or your wife or your mom or your dad and say, am I right with God? Because that is a personal thing, and we know within ourselves when we are or when we're not. That's just facts as they are. But I've given you this illustration to show you that in one night's time, it can all be lost. No matter how much, yes. Sure enough, Daryl, I agree with that totally. So what I'm trying to tell you is this. Remember the motto I gave you before I started preaching? Don't do today what you can put off till tomorrow. Well, that may work on some things. May work on carrying out the trash or washing clothes. There's some things you don't want to use that kind of motto on. And I'm going to tell you it's Jesus Christ. And God is speaking to your heart. When He's telling you that you need to make things right with Him, people, you don't need to put that off. That is so dangerous. Because you need to make sure that we've got things right between us and God while we have time. Remember the one verse I read a while ago when he was talking about even your breath is in God's hands. The next breath you may have, you may not have. It's all within the power of God. But why would that be? It's because we're His creatures. He made us. That's why. And so this morning, Roy, you and Larry, Connie will come up. I want to ask you the question. You made peace with God within your heart. And you'll know that peace needs to be there because you just feel so bad and not right with God. That can be taken care of right here this very morning. All you've got to do, because God has done send His Son to pay the price. But you've got to believe in Him. You've got to put your trust that Jesus, people, is your ticket to heaven. There's no other ticket. Jesus is it. You've got to make sure that your life is based on what He's done on the cross for you. This morning, if we could, would you stand with me this morning? I appreciate you listening to this. You know, if this was just my thinking, be different, but this is recorded in the Bible. There's other illustrations I could use. I could use the children of Israel when they refused to go into their promised land. And what happened when the next day they changed their mind and God said, no, you've made your decision. Now, the point is this. Are you right and are you ready to meet God? People, if you're not, we have a verse of invitation. You can take care of that right here this morning. You can come to God. We have a verse of invitation. Is God speaking to your heart this morning? Is there needs